why I'm particularly interested in the first session. It seems to be quite closely connected. This is the Curriculum and Pedagogy session. Usually there's enough time for 3 different presentations. We only have 2 scheduled. So that means we've got extra time, a little bit extra time for questions and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, we'll have the first presenters go, and about 20 minutes or so, and then about 5 minutes for questions. If the questions are still, lots of people have lots of questions, I'll probably stop it there, and we'll go to the second presenter, and do 5 minutes or so of questions there, and then sort of open the floor to people who just want to stick around and ask lots of questions. And then, of course, there's lunchtime after that, so we really do have a lot of extra flexibility for this particular session. And I'm sure it will be a great topic on the first one, and I know the second presenter well, so I hope you look forward to this. All right, let me introduce the first presenters. We've got Guy Smith and John Peloghitis over here, and they're both from the International Christian University, correct? And you can see the topic of their presentation up here, and I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you very much. So everyone, welcome to the presentation. John and I work at International Christian University, and critical thinking is a big part of the program there. We spend a lot of time looking at elements of critical thinking, and also trying to work critical thinking into the things that students do in their writing and reading. Our program is academic reading and writing. So those are writing essays, reading research papers, and getting ready for studies at university in various areas is our main focus of our program. And critical thinking is a huge part of that. John and I have been personally interested in critical thinking and cognitive processes for the past 4 or 5 years. Specifically, we've been interested in unconscious bias and conscious bias, and how unconscious thinking processes can affect conscious thinking. And so today our presentation is some activities that teachers can use to show students that their thinking processes might not be as under control as they think they are. The direction we're coming from here is by surprising students, by developing curiosity about their thinking processes. We're more likely to get them interested in understanding why they are thinking how they think, and also to look deeper into those thinking processes. And if they look into those thinking processes more deeply, they're more likely to think, well, how can I change those? How can I revise my thinking to be better? I quite like this quote, if knowledge is power, then curiosity is muscle. By getting students curious about their thinking and curious about how their thought processes work, they're more likely to start thinking about those and reflecting on them. So, for example, I like pizza. Where did that thought come from? When you think, I like pizza, I like sports, I like summer. Generally, that's the result of various thought processes that we do not have access to. For example, the taste sensation, the smell. These are areas of our brain that work together to produce the idea, I like pizza. But we do not have direct access to the sensory processing in our brain. Okay? We have if you can imagine a computer, the software is running and produces something on the screen, and we're seeing what's on the screen, but we don't have access to software behind that. This is an activity I like to use with my students just to show them that what they think and what they do is not always a good match. What they think may be affected by some of those unconscious thought processes that they don't realize they're actually working on their actions and behavior. So what I'll do is I ask them to put a number for I strongly disagree and I strongly agree. So all of the questions use I believe or I think or I believe, I think, I believe. So these are attitudes about certain ideas. For example, I believe that regular exercise 3 times a week helps to keep good health. I believe eating a variety of foods, including vegetables, every meal, to be important for health. So most students will put quite high numbers for these, like, oh yes, I believe that. Yes, 4 or 5, 4 or 5, 4 or 5. But then I ask them to look at this. These are the behavior questions. I take the time to exercise 3 times a week to stay in good health. I eat a variety of foods, including vegetables, of every meal for my health. I take an interest in politics. The scores are always lower. Okay, you get 2s and 3s. And I ask the students, you're thinking something, but you're doing something different. So what's going on here? And some of the ones who are like a bit, more reflective about their thinking will point out, well, maybe what I'm thinking consciously is not the only thought process that's going in my mind, and it's reflected in my behavior. And that's what we want them to think. We don't often do what we think. So our conscious thought processes are not the only thought processes that are affecting our behavior in our lives. And if students can understand that, that's a big step towards understanding that thinking is not just what's in your mind at the moment, conscious thoughts. We tend to think we have a lot of control over our thinking because our conscious thoughts are the ones we have access to. But there are very many other ones we don't have access to. The mismatch between attitudes and action shows students that what is in their conscious mind is not the only cognitive process affecting their behavior. Okay, could everyone just try this? Don't think about a white bear. It's quite a famous experiment. Were you able to not think about a white bear? So this is another activity which demonstrates to students that their conscious mind is not the only thought process that's going on in their mind. No matter how hard they try to not think about a white bear, that keeps popping up from some unconscious or some subconscious thought process. So the 3 examples I started with, I like pizza, and the difference between attitudes and actions, and don't think about a white bear, kind of general approaches to mismatches between thinking that your conscious mind has access to all of your thoughts and all of what's going on in your brain. John and I have particularly specialized in cognitive bias in the past 3 or 4 years. So for the rest of the presentation, we'd like to focus on cognitive bias. These cognitive biases are subjective tendencies or predispositions in conscious and unconscious thinking. Unfortunately, they've been called biases, which kind of brings a negative connotation to the word, but biases can be both good and bad. They can work for positive outcomes and negative outcomes. Some examples, the in-group bias. The in-group bias, for example, can have a negative outcome. Some in-groups may favor their other groups over other groups, leading to discrimination and various problems. But the in-group bias is also a very powerful force for keeping families together, keeping communities together. So it has both positive and negative side to it. Some of the other biases John and I have been researching and looking at: authority bias, the halo effect, anchoring, groupthink, and so on. So, for example, how old was Gandhi when he died? Was Gandhi older or younger than 92 when he died? Write a number. I do this a lot with my students. If I just go back a slide, the anchoring bias here. Once again, the anchoring bias is both the negative side and the positive side. The positive side is, if we think back to our roots as hunter-gatherers, when someone runs up and says there are 30 enemy tribesmen heading our way, that number was very important. What kind of reaction do you make to 30 enemy tribesmen? The anchoring bias can also have a negative effect. For example, in a car sales yard, when the salesman says this car is worth $2,500, it may not be worth that at all, but that number has already started to work on your mind, and you're thinking $2,500, can I get it for a bit lower than that? That anchor has been created. So with this exercise, because indeed there's a number, students tend to anchor around that number, and the numbers will be much higher, 94, 96, 97. What I'll do is I'll split the class into 2 sections. One gets this one gets this one. And I'll write the numbers on the blackboard or whiteboard. The average is always higher for the anchoring. It's always higher. I've never had a case where it hasn't been higher. One thing to be careful about, if you try this kind of anchoring exercise, small groups, it might not work. You need at least 15 or 20 in the group. get that average. So this is an example of anchoring bias, where decisions are influenced by a particular reference point and anchor. And I often point out to students, can you figure out why the average was higher between the groups? And some of the students will say, oh, was it the number? Once again, they're realizing that what they think is going on in their conscious mind may be affected by unconscious anchoring. There may be a number which is lodged in their mind, which is affecting their decision about something. Another interesting example I like to present to my classes is about Netflix. Netflix used to send watching suggestions to its viewers based on the shows they saved in their watch list. Netflix decided to stop sending suggestions based on what was in the customer's watch list. Does anybody know the reason why they decided to stop that? Well, I asked students this, and in the watch list, people would put all these kinds of movies that they think they should be watching, like documentaries, famous classic movies. Now, my own personal watch list is full of all these classic movies that I've never watched, but I think I should watch. So Netflix decided to send suggestions based on what people really watched, not what they think they should be watching. So in this case, the take-home point for the students is that in my side bias, we self-select information, often unconsciously, that suits a preferred view of the self. Okay, in this case, that you are a person who watches serious movies, and you're an intelligent person who watches documentaries, not the Marvel series, for example. Oh, okay, John, you want to take over?
I do talk over here. So Guy gave you some examples of some activities, some questions that kind of provoke some thought experiments that provoke students into thinking about their thinking, and also how biases manifest themselves in everyday life. Here's a couple more experiments that you can play around with. Just they're fun little activities that you can do in the beginning of class, at the end of class, that kind of, again, really generates some interesting debate. You can divide a class in half, give students version A, it's like slip of paper, version A, version B, and you'll see they're the opposite, basically, right? Researchers have found that people with low self-confidence are more susceptible to flattery than those with high self-confidence, as opposed to high self-confidence are more susceptible to flattery than low self-confidence. So give students a little time to think about this. What might be a reason for this? This is an important little time for them to kind of rationalize why this may be. And you'll get some really interesting results. This is what I found. In our classes, Guy and I have asked these questions, that you'll see that 80% of the students receive version A and 80% version B all think that their study is, the results are not surprising. Isn't that interesting? They're the exact opposite, but both groups are the same. What's really interesting is I actually had these groups, I had these groups actually meet and just talk about the experiment. They didn't know what version they had, but it came out when they talked. And then they were actually arguing against each other. No, you're not right. No, it makes sense because da 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 da. And you're just like, wow. They made up their own reasons, and here they are debating it. Who knew, right? Just how fast people throw themselves with the reasoning that they kind of put together. So why is this happening? Classic example of hindsight bias. I knew it all along. Right? Again, you need to have them. There needs to be a little thinking period there where they just need to sit on it and let it process. Let them take ownership of it. Right? But this is when new facts. There's actually two facets to hindsight bias. One is the new facts construe beliefs that the information is expected, even predictable. And also they perceive past events as predictable. So there's actually two kinds of facets of hindsight bias. Here's another interesting one. Choose several highly disputed statements. I would say more or less people, I would say highly disputed, but you could contest them. One is Italian food is better than Japanese food. in Japanese may not feel that way. Tokyo University is the best university. I meant to change it to Lakeland. Sorry guys. All elementary students should study English. For each of these items, I ask students to indicate whether they agree or disagree, and then what do they think the percentage of people in the class agree with them. Right? So if I think Italian food is better than Japanese food, yes or no, and then how many of you also agree with me? Right? Makes sense. Interesting. Generally, this is what you'll get. For example, studying English, agree. 40 is the frequency. So 77% of the students agree with that statement. Disagree only 23%. But look at this. They agree 72%. So if I agree with that statement, I think that's, generally you guys agree with me. But even the people who disagree also feel the same way. So it doesn't matter which side of the argument you're on, you still think that everybody's with you. Right? Powerful stuff, I think. So, this is called the false consensus bias. So people tend to give their opinions as being that of the consensus. A good activity to do in class is maybe just perspective shift. Like get in groups and try to feed off, like, how do you feel about this? Just to get to know that there's other opinions out there and that your opinion may not be the majority all the time. And one last little example I want to show you is like, if you look at 2015, 2016, which chart do you think shows a more dramatic increase? The first one or the second one? Between 2015 and 2016, which chart shows a more dramatic increase?
The left one seems to, right?
Yeah.
Just visually.
Exactly. Well, and you can see that the lines are they're almost all the same, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's not even that big of a change.
Right.
But you'll see here, this is the framing effect. The framing effect can have many uses. You could, like if I said 9 out of 10 doctors, as opposed to 1 out of 10, depending on how I state that, that would be the framing effect as well. But you'll see here, even like a slight little nuance. The chart on the left uses an aspect ratio of 3 to 5, and the one on the right 4 to 3. It's very small, but it really has a dramatic effect on how people see the data. So again, this is sort of a statistical literacy, if you will, kind of going into that realm. But students really need to take a step back and see how the information is presented to them, so they can see that it's presented in at least a more objective way.
John, can I just jump in for a moment? This is really powerful, labeling. If you have 30% protein on the label, you go, 30% protein. If you change that 70% fat, completely different. So the government in, I think it's New Zealand, requires labeling for both 30% protein and 70% fat, so consumers can see the numbers together. If they just have the 30% protein, that framing effect is so powerful that it just distorts their whole feeling of the product.
So again, this is the framing effect, the tendency to draw different conclusions from the same information. It just depends on how it's presented.
Okay, thanks, John. So just to kind of sum up what John and I talked about today, Emily Cronin, a researcher in America on bias, she's commented that if you try to teach people about the biases, if you say, anchoring bias is this, authority bias is this, my side bias is, it doesn't work. People don't react to that. What you need to do is show them that, educate people about the importance of unconscious processes. Once people start to realize that what's in their conscious mind is not everything that's going on in their thought process, then they will start to look at things differently. But trying to explain to them, you're exhibiting in-group bias, there's no effect at all. So John and I really think that one of the most important things for the future of critical thinking is for critical thinking to integrate this understanding that it's not what's in the conscious mind that is always the most important thing. These unconscious processes, biases, and various other unconscious processes of the mind are also affecting thinking, and students need to realize that in order to achieve any kind of real critical thinking.
That's really step one. That's really step one in the whole process. If we're going to teach critical thinking and anything about bias mitigation, step one, just raise an awareness that they are susceptible to bias. And then step two, step three would be like going along this kind of long process of maybe putting in place nudges or thinking frameworks that would help them to mitigate the possibilities of biases, infringing on rational thinking. So in the writing process, that comes up a lot in the writing process, how students choose topics, how they position their arguments, how they look for resources. You can see how bias can really get in there and really, of course there's good points of biases, but in this way there's also some limitations on the research and writing process.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, comments? Very welcome.
I have a question. So are there any examples that this kind of framework, that when we teach this to the students, and there are a long-term effect in terms of the way they are thinking and they are learning in their classes? Are there any concrete examples?
Concrete examples of?
In terms of how this process, like once they know about this process, will it affect the way they learn? Like any examples?
That's a great question, and until just recently it was thought that teaching people about biases was effective. That's why we had a lot of these diversity training projects happening around the world. But after they did the research about the diversity training and teaching people about various biases, they found a year later there was no impact. People had just gone back to what they were doing before. So Emily Cronin tried to figure out, why do we have all these diversity training things, teaching people about the information, but it's not changing them. And her research has shown that once they understand about the operation of the unconscious and how these things happen automatically, then they no longer claim to be less biased than others. So then they said, maybe I am biased. And that was the very first step in moving towards realizing your own thinking is not just what's in your conscious mind at that moment, which is vital for critical thinking. Thank you. From now, that research is happening. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. And I want to ask about so I was thinking why this unconscious, knowing, realizing unconscious bias is important now. If you have thoughts about why now is the time to reflect this unconsciousness of the people.
Do you mean now as in students or now as in 2022?
Now in 2022.
I think what you're asking is why should we teach this to students now when they're in the college? At IC, we actually have a unit on critical thinking, and we never had anything on bias. We taught fallacies, we taught ethos, logos, pathos. We taught all these other components, but we realized that cognitive bias is everywhere. And why aren't we even discussing it? So, and again, these little thought experiments don't take long. And they have a powerful effect on how students are wow, look how biased I am. And we don't mean to make them want to feel stupid. That's not the purpose of this, but just to open their eyes that we're all kind of prone to these thinking dispositions. And again, this is like the step one. It's just to get them started. Because it's everywhere in the research and writing process that we want to open their eyes to see how, when they're looking for sources, maybe it affects on order bias. The very first articles that pop up, they may think that those are the most credible, and things like that. So it's very important for our critical thinking unit to get them off and started in doing better research.
Yep.
I'm just curious, like, how many weeks is your term, and how many times a week do you meet your students, and how much time do you spend on the biases part?
Well, John and I do spend time on biases, but it's not a program-wide thing at the moment. We're trying to introduce it because we really believe that, you know, students realizing that their thinking may be affected by unconscious bias and various other things, because is the step before we should start teaching them about assumptions and various other things, because that leads them to try and think more deeply about the way they're approaching assumptions, the way they're approaching various elements of critical thinking. So we're just kind of trying to get this started.
Right.
Yeah, we have three 10-week semesters.
Oh,
It's like all academic reading and writing. They write a few essays over the year, and
We see them 3 times a week.
yeah,
Critical thinking is supposed to kind of be the foundation of the whole course.
but it's a learning objective that goes throughout the year for any of their writing assignments.
Okay, thanks.
Excuse me, I really enjoyed the presentation.
Thanks.
I was curious about what criterion or criteria is used in order to measure distance from objective truth. How does one measure whether the bias is towards or away from what one could determine as objective truth? The graph that you showed, showing the lines that seem to be more dramatically presented as perhaps being more biased, how does one determine that it's not the other graph that is in fact in closer proximity to truth?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure we can answer that, can we? It depends on the context, the person, the situation, the audience, what the goals of the information is. I mean, you could probably even say the first one was framed incorrectly as well.
Precisely. And so what comes out to me anyway is that it's very possible that the greatest value is to raise the student's level of consciousness that bias exists.
A reflection.
Precisely.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you. That's what I got.
Thanks for the
from it.
question.
Yeah, just getting different perspectives about what the truth can be or is a good way to start.
Thank you. Wow.
In my class, it may be a little bit connected to your point. I end up encouraging them to think of this as a spectrum, because sometimes they'll read about the bias and examples, and they'll come to class and say, I don't see a problem with this. Right? Why is it a problem? Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is not a thinking weakness. What has to change? Where does it change? At what point does it clearly become one? And of course, I always tell them, I can't tell you where that point is, but that awareness and that consideration of changing factors.
That reflection part is the most important starting point, I think, where they actually start thinking about, could my thinking be biased? The next conversation about the line of where it's effective and a problem, that's a really tough discussion. For example, my side bias, in group work, my side bias is very useful, because my side bias encourages you to present an opinion. Okay, this is what I think for these reasons. And if various people are presenting opinions, we get lots of opinions coming out. So it's very useful in that situation. But my side bias, for example, I love coffee. And I'll avoid articles which kind of say that coffee is not good for you. In that situation, my side bias is not so useful. So teasing out when these that's going to be kind of the next 20 years of research, I feel. Really important discussion.
I'm curious to know what you guys think of this. I am constantly telling them in class examples of when I was not thinking clearly. You know, this is not a point you ever graduate to. This is something that you're just constantly trying to hone. And I think they really respond to that. And I think it helps them be a little bit more reflective.
But couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, that's a great
Humble yourself.
Daniel Kahneman, who got this Nobel Prize for this kind of work, would say, "Oh, I know all about the biases. I've researched them, but I'm still prone to them." You just got to show students that yes, they are there. They're a part of us. Reflecting on them and trying to understand where it might be harmful and where it might be useful. That's the important step they need to start working towards.
And they probably love those stories, though.
Yeah.
Oh, they do, yeah, and there's usually some laughter, yes. And sometimes it was something that happened yesterday, you know, and I'm like, let me tell you what happened to me yesterday. And what I'm telling you, you probably want to avoid is exactly what I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, they really appreciate it. Any other questions, anybody?
I don't know, this isn't really exactly a question, but I'm still struggling to process what you just talked about and the questions that have been coming up. And thinking about like we have to assess the students, and how do we assess students with us not really sure if the students are, like the question you mentioned about how far is it from the objective truth. Like we can't assess them on that point unless that part is like there.
That's such a great question. John and I are not even close to that.
Yeah.
If you would figure that out,
Yeah,
send me an email, please.
What we're just kind of starting at, is helping students get to the realization that their thinking is not what's all in your conscious mind at the moment. Once they realize that, they might start thinking, wow, am I biased in some ways? Maybe I need to think about that and reflect on that and talk to my teachers and so on.
I think a big part of critical thinking is just like questioning yourself, questioning like why you're doing certain things, and again, lack of reflection. And just, I think this is like a start of that process, reflecting and questioning your reasoning of selecting, again, sources, writing on this topic. Some students, like, if you ask them to do a topic, they'll choose topics that they're already familiar with, a position that they're familiar with. And we're just kind of like perspective sharing, that kind of thing, so they get the knowledge of other people's opinions and maybe a different perspective.
This is the last question. Do you think this framework can be applied even for teachers? Because sometimes teachers make unconscious biases.
Who?
Sometimes.
Are you in her class?
No. In my school. Sometimes, yeah. And how can teachers make sure that they are not imparting their own biases to the students?
Well, actually, in class essay writing assignment, we just did that a few weeks ago. Do you want to explain the numbers and the names?
Why don't you start?
We just recently had an in-class essay writing assignment, and we prepared one sheet with the instructions and the student's name and ID, but the answer sheet only had the student's ID number. Because, you've had that student for 5 or 6 weeks, you've built up a relationship, and the name has an influence on you. So when you see that name on the answer sheet, immediately unconscious biases and influences kind of bubbling up. So it was very interesting for us, right, when we had our discussion with our teaching group, that we'd look at the in-class listening writing assignment after we graded, matched up with the name, and sometimes we'd be surprised. That student wrote that well. If we had had the name there, that grade might have been a little bit different, maybe up a little bit or down a little bit. So yeah, teachers need to know.
I just want to add that we talked about this at a few different places already, different aspects of cognitive bias. But people always ask about the teachers. You talk about the students, but what about the teachers? So maybe there's some problems going on.
All right, shall we take that as
there's
the...
Yeah, well, I mean, as a teacher, actually I'm going to talk about bias, a different type of bias. But often in my lectures, there's something that I know is certainly coming from, especially my professional background as a performer. I teach music. So I will say, this is from my bias and my perspective. I'm very clear about that, so that the students know, okay, well, this is coming straight from me, from my heart, right? And it's, there may be objective truth in it, but take it for what it's worth. That's one way to kind of get around that.
Shall we segue?
Segue into.
So by all means, we have more time after this, lunches after this. We only have 2 presenters instead of 3, so there will be plenty of time to continue this.
Well, I'm gonna talk for
great
15
discussion.
minutes. No, just
And why don't we just take a minute or two to
Yeah.
let them transition, the
Straight on.
presenters finishing up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.